Hello Team Pima, welcome to the last video for Chapter 18, Immune Disorders 5. So those would include autoimmune diseases. So here's, in this cartoon it shows autoimmune disorders. I don't know, like, what's the latest thing? Do they call them a disorder or a disease? I'm not sure, probably call both, but the triggers for autoimmune diseases include, number one, stress, hormones, metals, food antigens, and pesticides and poisons. And here's some of the tissues that an autoimmune disease can affect. So here's a cartoon of the thyroid gland, and the autoimmune diseases would include Hashimoto's, thyroiditis, and Graves' disease. Autoimmune disorders of the blood include leukemia, lupus, hemolytic, and dysglycemia. The GI tract autoimmune disorders include celiac disease, Crohn's, and ulcerative colitis. And I've heard those a lot on commercials selling drugs for those. Autoimmune disorders of the nerves include peripheral and diabetic neuropathy. So pathy comes from pathology, and disease. Autoimmune disorders that affect the lungs include asthma, Wegener's granulomatosis. And the skin autoimmune disorders include eczema, psoriasis, scleroderma, and vitiligo. I think Michael Jackson had vitiligo. I can't remember. Anyway, autoimmune disorders of muscles include fibromyalgia and muscular dystrophy. Autoimmune disorders of the bones include rheumatoid arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, and polymyalgia rheumatica. And then the brain, autoimmune disorders include multiple sclerosis, autism, Guillain-Barré syndrome, and psychological disorders. So there's a lot in the autoimmune disease chapter. What is an autoimmune disease? It's when the immune system goes wrong on some molecular level and starts targeting its own tissues. They develop spontaneously and randomly. They're more common in older individuals and women. Why they develop is unclear, but there's a lot of hypotheses, including genetics and environmental factors. There's two types of autoimmune diseases. There's single organ autoimmune diseases and systemic autoimmune diseases. So single organ autoimmune diseases include blood cells, so autoantibodies, autoantibodies destroy your red blood cells. Also, you can target the single endocrine organs. So in autoimmune diseases, you can produce autoantibodies against the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas. So here's pancreas in this cartoon, and they cut out a little area here and enlarge it and show the whole thing is an islet of Langerhans. It has beta, alpha, delta cells in it, and if you destroy cells in these islets of Langerhans in the pancreas, you can't produce insulin. So you could have type 1 diabetes, which is juvenile diabetes. You could also be destroying your islets of Langerhans because of viral infection. And then there's another single organ autoimmune disease that affects the single organ called the thyroid. Autoantibodies will stimulate overproduction of thyroid hormone. Again, that could be set off by viral infection or your genetics. And here's a cartoon of the thyroid gland situated over the trachea. More single organ autoimmune diseases. You can affect the nervous system, so your immune system can target nervous tissue that would result in multiple sclerosis. So here, you probably remember this from 202. Here's your nerve fiber, aka your nerve axon. It's wrapped in a myelin sheath, and then, so this looks like it's from the peripheral nervous system. It's got these Schwann cells forming the normal myelin sheath. And when it gets damaged, the myelin sheath is damaged in this part of the cartoon, and you can't transmit your action potentials as well or as fast. So you have a problem in your neuromuscular function, especially if these axons are going to your skeletal muscle. More single organ autoimmune diseases would be, for example, rheumatoid arthritis. So that's also a type 3 hypersensitivity. Autoantibodies are formed against the connective tissue in your joints. Immunodeficiency diseases then would include primary immune deficiencies. That means you're born with it. So here's the column that talks about primary immunodeficiencies. So you could have a predominant antibody defect in your B cells. You could have combined B and T cell defects. Other cellular immunodeficiencies. You could have a defect in your complement system. Remember, complement proteins form the membrane attack complex in lyse bacterial cells. You could have a defect in your phagocytes, your macrophages, your neutrophils, your eosinophils. And then you could just have a general immune dysregulation in primary immunodeficiency. In secondary immunodeficiency, that usually develops later in life as a result of malnutrition, severe stress, or an infectious disease. And it can result in, for example, diabetes, HIV. You can also take a bad turn, a prolonged serious illness, hospitalized. You might have to hospitalize. So let's look at primary immunodeficiency diseases. Many of these diseases have been identified in all aspects of body defenses. So remember, there's the first, second, and third line of defense. So remember, the first line of defense shows in this cartoon is the skin and the mucous membranes. The second line of defense include all these cells. The third line of defense, remember, involves the T cells and B cells. So you could have a failure in all three lines of defense. You could also just have a failure to develop both your B cells and your T cells. So that'd be a failure in the third line of defense. That would result in an immunodeficiency disease. So here's maybe you've heard this, SCID, severe combined immunodeficiency. So in a normal immune system, you make your B and T cells, you fight infections. In a person with severe combined immunodeficiency, you don't have normal B and T cells, so you cannot fight infections. And so maybe you've heard of there's movies, there's been a couple movies about these children. This is a photograph actually of what they call a bubble boy that has to live in this bubble because he doesn't have any B or T cells, so he can't fight off any infections. If you have a defect in your T cell system but not your B cell, that's called DiGeorge syndrome. If you have a defect in your B cell system and not your T cell system, that's a Bruton type A gamma globulinemia. I had to say that slow, so I had to say it right. And then this is a cartoon of some types of severe combined immunodeficiency. So here's your bone marrow in the bone making your lymphoid stem cell that makes your T cells and your B cells. And then those T cells and B cells may not function properly. It can result in all these different problems. So secondary or acquired then immunodeficiency diseases, the immune system deteriorates with age and you can get a secondary immunodeficiency disease, especially loss of T cell production. So you have more viral diseases, you have more cancer as you get older. Stress can cause suppression of your T cell system. Malnutrition, so this photograph shows some children with malnutrition. If you're malnourished, that inhibits production of B and T cells, that decreases your immune system defenses. And then acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS, is an infection by a human immunodeficiency virus. And this is kind of called the Kaposi sarcoma. It's called the old AIDS, but now there's a lot of cocktails for people with HIV. And here's this cartoon. Stress can kill you. Well, it can if your immune system isn't working. So let's look at AIDS caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. We kind of talked a little bit about this when we did the viruses. So here's human immunodeficiency virus. So it's got a capsule on the outside. It's got a capsid here, this orange thing, and then it's got its nucleic acid, and then it's got its spikes on the outside. So the spikes can recognize these CD4 proteins in helper T cells, and once this matchup occurs between the attachment protein, or the spike, and the receptor, or CD4 protein, the virus is endocytosed, and then the virus is uncoated. So the double-stranded DNA, which is what HIV is transcribed from single-stranded RNA by reverse transcription. Oh, I said that wrong. The human immunodeficiency virus is a single-stranded RNA, which needs to be reverse transcribed into double-stranded DNA. So then you can use a double-stranded DNA to start making your own viral proteins. And then after the virus's single-stranded RNA is reverse transcribed by the enzyme reverse transcriptase, the viral double-stranded DNA goes into the nucleus of the T cell and integrates using an enzyme called integrase into the human DNA. And then when the human DNA gets transcribed into, well, when the human DNA and the viral DNA, which is right here in the provirus, gets transcribed, you're actually transcribing viral RNA, and that viral RNA makes viral proteins, and then the viral proteins get put together to make a virus. And then it shows here the virus. Here's the cytoplasmic membrane of the host cell. And it shows the GP120 and GP41 spikes are put here in the membrane. And then when the virus leaves, so the virus, when it leaves, it'll take that part of your cell membrane with these spikes, GP41 and GP120, to give it its envelope. And now you've got a mature virus released to the environment. So let's look at our check mark down here. It says the HIV virion uses GP120 and GP41 spikes to recognize and attach to the CD4 and CCR5 receptors. So it doesn't show the CCR5 receptors in this cartoon up here, but it shows the CD4 on the surface of helper T lymphocytes. Okay. So the trick here is the virus makes its own spikes, puts those spikes into the cell membrane of the helper T cell, and then when the virus leaves, it steals this part of the cell membrane from the helper T cell to give it its envelope, which is this outer part here. So AIDS is a syndrome, and it's characterized by one or more opportunistic diseases and the presence of HIV. So you get HIV, and then an opportunistic disease that could ensue might be something like pneumonia. So the virus will ultimately kill the helper T cell population, And if you don't have helper T cells, then you have a weak immune system, and then that's how you ultimately develop AIDS.